literally just circling the sun right now. That's the last entry, was that it was last seen orbiting the sun, and it's going to come, but it's a lot deeper than people realize. And then all of a sudden, this KC-135 met it and refueled it. That's right when it dropped off radar.
Nothing in this show should be considered legal, medical, or financial advice. The views of the callers can differ considerably and do not necessarily reflect my opinion, Dex's opinion, or anyone else who works with the show. You should always do your own research and consult with professionals. The internet is full of fake news, so please take everything with a grain of salt. I want to remind everybody that this show is brought to you by Energy. Energy, we are actually powered by an Energy Flex 1500. Again, this is a solar generator. It is absolutely silent, which means it is not going to be heard from blocks away like a gas-powered generator. So go to marfooglenews.com/energy. Use the code Marfoogle for upwards of $170 off. It's an amazing product. Jake, you're live on Marfoogle News.
Excellent. So I'm not sure which picture might come up first. I'm watching on my computer, but the first picture is going to be a photo, or a screenshot rather, of the like air traffic going around. It'll show Texas, Louisiana, and the Gulf of Mexico, and particularly it's showing one aircraft. It's an E6. Essentially, it's the command control of essentially what's going to be going on in the area. Now, this per se is not abnormal. The only thing I found interesting is that it took off at 9:55 in the morning, and then when it dropped off radar, it was around 5 o'clock in the afternoon. So I would assume it was probably close to a 12-hour-long flight, which again is probably doing a test of their legs to see if they can actually withstand a mission like that. But what I thought was interesting is that, so I'm in North Texas, and that second picture is going to be when it actually flew over my house. But it went right over DFW, which I thought was a bit strange, is that it basically didn't care, and that it flew right over approach and everything like that. It was, and that's the photo that you have pulled up, zoomed in on the E6 right there. What I also think is interesting is that it flew over the Gulf of Mexico and was doing circles and doing its whatever it was doing. And it reminded me, and you mentioned this earlier in the show, where certain countries have the ability now that can trigger tsunamis or earthquakes or, things like that. And it reminded me of a story in 2012 when a Bear sub was in the Gulf of Mexico and no one knew. It apparently went into the Gulf of Mexico, did its thing. No one knows what it was doing, what kind of war game it was doing, or any of that. And then the only reason why we found out about it is when it was leaving, it surfaced. And that's when submarine. Our Navy picked it up on. What's up?
Did you know also that Vlad's submarine came into the Puget Sound near Seattle? They actually bragged about it, and they said, we can get right into your city, and nobody even detected us. They took a picture on the top of their submarine with Seattle in the background. This was something that, they said, hey, this is national security here. They rolled up in a submarine into the Puget Sound and were not detected until they were close enough to throw a rock at us. I mean, we're talking about that story earlier of this crazy little island in Alaska being close to Vlad's country. They were in our Puget Sound.
Everywhere's close.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible. And they have long-range stuff on all those submarines. So for them to be even that close,
exactly,
that's incredible. Not good, to say the least.
No, not at all. And what was interesting is that that's basically the entire Gulf of Mexico. They said that they were in there for several days. And I mean, you can traverse that entire region and kind of do circles and make it out in several days, but you can hit everything that was, Houston, Houston, New Orleans, all these major port cities are nothing. And that's just, several, maybe 20, 30 miles inland. I mean, that's not to mention you have Carswell here, which now is the Joint Reserve Base. But I mean, you can hit that. You can hit a missile at a certain range can actually be launched and hit Whiteman, which is the only base for B-2 boomers, the stealth.
Yeah.
And speaking of that, there were 2 of those that flew over or are now in the region of G. And currently I also have notes that there were, and this was mentioned in the chat earlier as well, but there's 4 B-52s that are going to the UK. But what I found was interesting is that there's no real game scheduled, and they dropped live ordnance on a range over there. So they were carrying live stuff, and they, dropped a payload and an ordnance, they dropped that in this range. But I mean, they could have kept going easily, because I mean, those guys have outstanding range. And what was interesting about this E6 here that you have pictured is it flew north of me and then hooked right, so it flew east. And then all of a sudden, this KC-135, that took off at 9:55 as well, met it and refueled it. So, and then that's right when it dropped off radar. So, I mean, this thing could have been in the air for another, whoever knows how long, because these guys are meant to stay up in the air for a while, because that's essentially what is going to be commanding and controlling all air traffic in the region. So I thought that was interesting. I figured I would bring that up to you guys. And then throughout the show, I was taking notes, and you mentioned the moon and how much of a role that would play if anything were to pop off. And one, I completely agree. I think that space, whether it be, I know that certain people don't agree, and there's a discussion on whether it exists or not, but whatever it means, I think that the military thinks it exists, and they have invested heavily in controlling it. I mean, that whole concept of Solar Warden comes to mind, where it was some dude hacked DARPA one day and pulled a bunch of files, started reading it because he got bored, and then all of a sudden he found this thing called Solar Warden, and it ended up that it was this deep sky work project that they were simultaneously doing when they built the SR-71, and effectively it was just a high atmospheric cruise ship, essentially, aircraft carrier of sorts, and it has several ships that go with it, and it's deep space, and no one really knows what it is, no one knows what it's doing. But if this file is to be believed, which I mean, I've looked into it, and I think it kind of is, it's literally just circling the sun right now. That's the last entry, was that it was last seen orbiting the sun, and it's going to come, but it's human made. It's from us, and we are a lot deeper than people realize. And then there's a book that comes to mind, mentioning the moon again. There's a book that comes to mind called Mutineer's Moon. And effectively what it is the moon is considered to be a starship that, lack of a better term, ran out of gas. And so the crew that was on the moon mutinied against the commanding officers, and they came down to Earth, and all this stuff happened. Well, what I think is interesting is that whenever that test happened with China, where they launched the rocket, and the moon started to ring for hours. Well, the only thing I can think of that rings is metal on metal. And if you launch a rocket at the moon and it starts to ring, well, maybe there is validity to the concept of the moon being a starship. However far-fetched that is, you never know. But I just think it's an interesting concept.
Did you see,
especially because the book came out in the 60s.
Did you see Moonfall?
Now no, I have not seen Moonfall, but I want to.
It's not. I mean,
that was actually one of the.
It's a bad movie, but the concept. Yeah, I mean, it's bad as in like, it's got horrible, in my opinion, bad acting, and the lines are like, oh god, you roll your eyes a few times a minute. But of course, the graphics are up there with really good end of the world movies. but it's like silly. Like water is hitting a lot of stuff didn't make sense. But at the same time, they basically say that the moon is like some sort of gyrosphere with some sort of alien race inside of it. I guess why people get so freaked out when you say that kind of stuff is that we have been taught one thing, and I guess my brain has always been wide open because I have believed in something so hard and then found out I was wrong. And then I'm like, well, wait a second. If I was wrong about that, that means I could be wrong about all of this stuff. And I never want to be concrete and believe something 100% to the point where I'm calling other people stupid, because I think I've believed something in my own inner truth. I knew this was a fact. But at the same time, over the last few years, they have completely changed things. And I see how they're representing history and in media. If you think about it, even if you don't believe the news is putting out something that you saw with your own eyes, and you're like, that's not how it was. And then you go, that's what's going to be in the history books. So all of a sudden, in 10 years, if somebody looks back, that is fact. That is looked at as history. But for the people there, they're like, no, it went a whole different way. So then I think back to what I learned, and I'm like, well, what if that's why I heard somebody say history is basically the lies that we agreed to write down or something. Like, you never know what's going to be next. We don't know. What if they've had a base up there for 50 years and I just say keep a mind open. Like, what if they made up the Van Allen thing and whatever else? None of us have actually been to space. That's the thing. I'm not saying that anybody's wrong or anybody's right, but what if that was an op? They have confused us so many times, and we know for a fact it's been declassified that one of their tactics is to completely confuse us and tell us something is this and that, and they'll just keep going in circles so people never know the truth. They have technology, and they've known they've had it for a long time, but then they make it like, in the news, they're like, we barely can do hypersonics. It's like, it doesn't make too much sense. So I get what you're saying.
And then there were just a few other things I'd like to point or to bring up. One of them you mentioned earlier about the Dragon shutting down a few of its factories due to heat, quote unquote. But it also brought up something that you brought up, I guess, a few days ago about the Bear and how they shut down and revamped their manufacturing to fit the need of conflict. And I just thought it would be interesting if the Dragon, stops all these factories, sends the workers home, and then brings in the military who can't say anything, and just starts building all these things needed for conflict, and no one will know any different because no one's there to report it or to smuggle any information out. Like it's all just hidden.
Oh, you know what? I cannot believe I didn't think of that. So what we covered the other day, what he is mentioning is that Vlad said that they are actually turning a bunch of their factories into wartime factories. So instead of making, say, cotton swabs, they're going to be making bullets. And they're doing it across many, many, many factories. Well, just within 2 days of reporting that, now Xi is saying that they're shutting down all these factories. Well, maybe they're shutting down what they're making. So now to the rest of the planet, they're like, well, why can't we order our, Xi-made, Dragon-made cotton swabs? Well, that's because that factory's closed because of heat. When really they're actually turning that factory into, they're amassing all sorts of stuff in a short amount of time, say building tanks or building whatever, because they're preparing for something big.
I mean, yep. Well, and then also a few days ago, actually, I believe it was Sunday going into Monday, the Dragon, because you also brought up earlier about the markets and things like that. Well, the Dragon pulled out of the stock market. The three major companies, one of them being oil, I believe one other being property, pulled out of the stock market. So, I mean, that alone will cause enough strife within the market to actually slow it down. Of course, we haven't really seen anything yet about it, but what's interesting is that for whatever reason here lately, whatever bad news shows up, the markets rise, and whatever good news shows up, the markets fall. So I'm almost kind of curious to see what actually the outcome is going to be if these three major companies pull out. Are we actually going to see anything, or is it just going to be business as usual because it's all inflated anyway until it's not? And then the last thing I want to bring up is the bear country, and how you were talking about how the agreements and everything like that, or the not agreements, but rather they will send all the high-tech stuff to Latin America. I would also like to remind some of the viewers that they currently have an agreement right now with Venezuela, and I believe Cuba. I'm not entirely certain. However, in regards to airbase usage, so they can park whatever they want to, whatever can make it to those air bases at those air bases. And so, I mean, if they want to park any of the major boomers, they can. If any of the 5th gen stuff they have, if they can make it there, they can park them there. And so, I mean, like, as much as we would like to, the notion of being, completely isolated because of 2 oceans, well, I mean, they already have subs in the Gulf and Puget Sound and boomers in a few miles south of Mexico. And let's face it, a 30-minute flight with a range of a rocket that they can send off, having, a couple hundred miles. I mean, they essentially have surrounded us, or at least agree through a policy-wise can surround us with whatever they want to. And I just think it would be beneficial for a lot of people to kind of wake up that it's not as hunky-dory as the media may like to, with the bear and UKR. I don't think it's going as well as people would like to agree on either side. I think both sides are hemorrhaging right now, and it's just a race to see who bleeds out first.
Well, Jake, we're out of time on the show, actually, not even just the call. But I wanted to say I would love to hear from you again. I know everybody else would too.
Of course.
And I agree with you on that too. I think that neither side is right. Certain things are being held back, and a lot of things are being misconstrued. That's why we say just don't. Wouldn't believe anything, because they could be telling us something, so we do believe something. It's like every day you should think of it as like maybe this was an acid trip for the entire planet, because none of it could be real. Thank you, Jake, for calling in.
I'm wearing shorts, bitter critter.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you. Let me just remind everybody, if you haven't already, make sure to go over and check out marfooglenews.com/prep. Right now, there is actually the first time ever that they are doing $250 off on a 3-month supply of food. That 3-month supply of food has 3 meals a day for one person for 3 months. And also it has all of the calories and everything needed to actually survive and actually live well for 3 months. Now, that has been $150 off before. It has never been $250 off. That is the biggest discount. Also, this is extremely high demand and low supply as far as freeze-dried foods are getting harder and harder to find. So if you do have the ability to go get these, I would highly recommend it. On top of that, though, they have a small sale on the smaller packages. Make sure to go check out the different ones there. You can also get a 72-hour kit if you just need 3 days of food and you want to have an emergency in the back of your trunk. They have that as well, all sealed and bucketed so you can bury it, put it in your trunk, put it in your basement, wherever you want to put it, you can. marfooglenews.com/prep. That's marfooglenews.com/prep. And then also check out all their other stuff like the Alexa Pure Pro, which is, again, everybody talks about Berkey's. This does the same thing for a fraction of the cost, and it is absolutely amazing. It gets 99.9999% of 206 contaminants, targeting heavy metals, lead, fluoride, chlorine, viruses, bacteria, pesticides, and even pharmaceuticals. If you don't trust your waters, I highly recommend it. If you have that and, of course, freeze-dried food stored away with a 25-year shelf life, you're pretty much set.
Feed the haters to the alligators. Your way or the highway, see you later. B.O.D. is the homie and Mr. Vader. If it wasn't for you, I would never made it. Whole city's covered by the cremated. Now they listen to what we were saying. Doesn't matter if the manufacturer or created. But now